Okay, I think we're live. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this conversation on the state of the Great Salt Lake with Dr. Bonnie Baxter, who is a microbiologist and the director of the Great Salt Lake Institute here in Salt Lake City at Westminster University. Bonnie has been studying Great Salt Lake for 26 years, so she's had a front row seat to the crisis that's been unfolding as the lake has been drying. My name is Brooke Larson. I'm a fellow with High Country News, which is a nonprofit magazine that has been covering the West for more than 50 years. Throughout this conversation, if you want to ask questions, please drop your comments on either Facebook event or the YouTube live streams, and we'll get to them at the end. So I recently interviewed Bonnie for a Q&A story about the emotional toll of studying the Great Salt Lake as it dries up, and it sparked some conversation. We heard from scientists and activists that it resonated with them and their experience studying and working on Great Salt Lake, as well as other imperiled ecosystems across the West. It also stirred up some controversy, which we'll get into later in the conversation, but also just some questions. People were seeing the lake levels were going up after 2 wet winters, so we thought it would be useful to dive into where the lake really is at today, as well as chat some more about what it's been like for Bonnie and other scientists to study the lake in crisis. And when I say crisis, if some folks who are tuning in are new to this issue, I'm referring to the record low water levels at Great Salt Lake. So in 2022, Great Salt Lake reached a record low, and that has had all sorts of implications for wildlife and humans who live around the lake. So, Bonnie, I'd love to just start there and give our listeners a foundation for what's been happening at the lake the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years. What is the crisis at Great Salt Lake?
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. So, since the high point of the 80s, we've just been going generally down, 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 down. A terminal lake, because it's like a bowl, in this case, a shallow saucer, it only fills up when it gets this input, and it only loses water with evaporation. So you need to keep those things in balance to keep the lake level the same. Um, in contrast, like a regular lake would get input from rivers, and it would stay at kind of a normal elevation, and then it trickles downstream to the ocean. And that's not the way a terminal basin works. So that's why the input is really, really important. And so as the input has declined, largely because we're using too much of the water upstream, it's not making its way down to the lake. So yes, it's normal for the lake elevation to go up and down, but it's not normal for it to just continue to decline. And we can measure the water that used to make it to the lake that is no longer making it to the lake. So those calculations show that this is actually a crisis of water usage. And now that comes up against the pressures of climate change. And we all know that we're having hotter summers. That was predicted. If you can not think about last year, this giant winter year, which was kind of an aberrant year that we get every dozen or so years, we really are getting less snow. The predictions for climate change are more rain and less snow. Higher temperatures, higher evaporation rates come with all of that, because rain just sort of runs off the land, and snow has time to melt slowly and recharge the aquifers. So snow is better for our watershed in terms of keeping it healthy. So those climate change pressures are now at play, and they're coming up against a system that we've been holding back the water from because of our consumptive uses. So that's what the crisis is. But now, where are we right now? Last year was a gift. Mother Nature gave us this abundant amount of snow, and it was wonderful. And all over the West, we really reaped the benefits, not just from last year, but also we're still feeling it this year because it was so big. So, but the land was very dry. The lake was the lowest it's ever been. And so all of that snow, the good thing is it filled up all the reservoirs, it recharged the aquifers, The lake rose about 5.5 feet, but we lost 3 feet in the summer to evaporation, which we always do. So let's say it goes up 6 feet, it goes down 3 feet last year. That's cool. We still got an elevation gain for the first time in a really, really long time. That's great. So we're up 3 feet. So now, because um, I should say, as of the historic low, we were behind 11 feet from the happy place, from the place where the biology does really well on the lake. The elevation where we want to keep the lake, that range, we were 11 feet below that range. So we're up 6, we're down to 3. So plus 3 is still not 11, right? So great. So we need to climb a little more. Well, good for us that last winter left those reservoirs so full, because now some more water trickled down this year, and our inflows were pretty good this spring because they didn't have to fill the reservoirs and fill the aquifers. They were already wet. So now we get another, we're up another 6 feet. We'll lose another 3 feet. By the end of the year, probably we're going to end up being about 5 feet towards that 11 feet total that we need to make up. And I think we don't expect to get big winters every winter. So that's concerning. So we have a little buffer, right? We've got a little bit more water in the lake, but we still, with all this winter, never made it up to the happy place where the lake ecosystem is really doing its best and performing its best. And the dust is down because we have water in this basin. We haven't made it to that place yet. So this gives us a little more time, but it doesn't solve the problem. And I think that we know without intervention in the system, it's just not going to get better in the future, despite an occasional big snow year.
Yeah. And you study the biology of the lake. I'm curious if you can talk a bit more about what you were seeing in the biology a few years ago that started alarming you and where that's at today as the lake levels have gone up a bit.
Yeah, so I study the tiniest things in the lake, but I oversee other projects that study some of the invertebrates. So I study the things that the brine shrimp and the brine flies eat, and those microbial mats on the bottom of the lake started dying off, and we started getting worried. And it was the high salinity plus, as the lake shrinks, these mats were becoming exposed and drying out. And that's not good. It's kind of like if you've spent any time on the West Coast in these little tidal pools where the tide goes out and the whole ecosystem sort of dries up, and they've all got these barnacles close up, and everybody, and then the water comes back and they're like, yay. Except this was not over the course of hours. This was years of drying out. And that resilience is there because it's a system where the water should go up and down, and there should be some resistance to drying out, but we're really pushing the system too far. So we started getting really nervous because the mats were dying. The flies completely disappeared. We think now what they were doing in small populations were hanging out at little groundwater seeps where they could get some water, because this last year when we were able to fill the lake again, those flies started repopulating the shores. It's very cool. And it really shows us that the biology is very resilient here. But if you go to the North Arm, where the pink water is, you will see that you can keep things too dry and too salty too long, and you can't rehabilitate that. That biology that exists in the South Arm, this robust ecosystem, it isn't present there. And so, we know decades is way too long. But being dry over the course of a year and then being wet again is probably okay. So we're learning a lot about what the system can tolerate and how resilient it is. And I find that fascinating. But when we have year after year after year of desiccation, like we've had until last winter, I think that we we get really nervous because we start to see things die, and the birds that eat the shrimp and the flies were really emaciated and weren't doing well. The pelicans abandoned ship, probably because predators made their way to the island. We have camera evidence for that. So I think that the biology really isn't built to tolerate those longer stints of desiccation and too saltiness. Overly salty, overly dry, not good.
Yeah.
Mhm.
What would you say is still needed to get the lake up to a healthy level? Do you think it's possible?
Yeah, I think the solutions, really don't sit with us, biologists. I think the solutions sit with social scientists and with water law and water policy, and that's really out of my wheelhouse. But it's very clear that we need to get more water to the lake, and how that happens, whether the state gets more people to lease their water rights, or gets better at shepherding the water, or helps farmers measure the water they're using. Maybe charging more for water could de incentivize wasting water. There's lots of things that really we haven't done a lot of yet. I think some of the recent pieces of legislation are moving in that direction, which is great, but we haven't seen a lot of success with those things yet. Um, and again, it's out of my wheelhouse. I think one of the things that we're only beginning to understand is the social science surrounding the lake. If you think about water use, like there's a lot of decision making involved. That we need we need psychologists and sociologists at the table to understand that. And I think people who study the way humans and communities make decisions, particularly about natural resources, like we need those people present, and we need to understand um, humans' role in saving the system.
Yeah. I'm curious, one thing I was thinking about when people responded to the story, the Q&A with you that's up on HCN's website, it seemed like people really wanna celebrate that the water levels are going up, right? And I'm curious if you can speak to, like, this balance of both celebrating that the water levels are up, celebrating we've had these 2 wet winters, while also being grounded in the larger reality of the situation at the lake.
Yeah. I think everybody had a little trepidation about complacency. Um, we worry that people get complacent and they aren't paying attention anymore. And but I'm not originally from I'm from North Carolina. I'm not originally from Utah, and we have a lot of water back in North Carolina. I grew up playing in the ocean, and I'm just used to big rains and lots of water. And it's a really different system out here. And I find that people out west really do understand these issues better than they're giving credit for. There's no one I've talked to who thinks we're going to have a giant snowmageddon every winter. Like we all know that. We live here, we live outside, we play outside. People in Utah, they know that. They also know what bad air quality is. When I give public talks, like there's no one who says, "Oh, I don't mind the bad air quality," or "So what if dust blows into the valley?" Because of inversions, because of fire smoke, like we in Utah understand that. And I guess I haven't been as worried about complacency as other people, because I do see people in the West sort of having an innate understanding of those issues, and also celebrating the great outdoors and loving to be outside and loving landscapes and beauty. And even the farmers I've talked to, I mean, farmers are biologists. They understand what's going on. So I'm a little bit maybe too optimistic about that, but I haven't seen a lot of that complacency, but I've heard a lot of people say they're concerned about that. I think in the legislature, there always is a concern about complacency, and rightfully so, because whatever people get upset about at that very moment, that's a human nature thing. Those are the things they talk to their legislators about. And so if we are having a lot of snow, nobody's going to talk about the lake drying up during the legislative session. So that psychology makes sense to me, but otherwise I don't really get too concerned about complacency.
Yeah, that's interesting. That makes sense.
Yeah.
From there, I want to turn more to your personal relationship with the lake and how you've been impacted by this experience of really watching the lake dry firsthand. So, you've been researching the lake for 26 years. That's a long time to witness the lake and the changes. Why were you first drawn to the Great Salt Lake? What makes it a special place or interesting place to research?
Yeah. I think I was missing the ocean. Was like, what? I'm going to move out here for this job and I don't have an ocean nearby. That's really going to be hard for me. I've just always liked water sports and being outside, and I was a backpacker and camper, and um, I, yeah, well, Terry Tempest Williams knows the story well, but I actually was postdocing in Washington State. So after I finished my PhD in North Carolina, I moved out to Washington. And I really, really loved the West. And I thought it was awesome. And I thought when I look for a job, I'm going to look for a job in the West because I need at least 5 years to see the West, right? So, and now 26 years later, I'm still out West because obviously 5 years is not long enough. So I moved here for a job. And when I was in the lab up in Washington, I went to a yoga class one night and I was like, hey, yeah, I'm going to Salt Lake City to interview. And this friend in my yoga class said, oh, I've got a book in my car I want to give you. If you're going to Salt Lake City, you have to read Refuge. And so I got the book from her and I read it on the plane and I cried the whole way here because it's such a tear-jerking story and you should never read it on the plane because that's embarrassing. But anyway, when I got to my interview, they were like, oh, so what are you going to work on in your research with students? And I was like, well, I've been working on the way the environment damages our DNA, particularly sunlight damage and skin cancer. It was one of the things I was studying. And I'm really curious about the way extreme life, like that lives in hot springs in Yellowstone or in Great Salt Lake, how that extreme life handles all this DNA damage. What happens, and what kind of secrets can we learn from them about helping us with skin cancer and those kinds of things? So those were my initial questions. Like, could I get some microbes from the lake? And could I see what kind of strategies they were using to keep their DNA healthy? And it turned out they have lots of secrets and nobody had been studying them. So my students and I had all these publications and all this interest in our research. And at the time, nobody was really working on Great Salt Lake biology other than the Brine Shrimp Cooperative and the state agency that manages that. And nobody was asking these kind of cool science questions. So yeah, that's how I got into it. And then I sort of became the Great Salt Lake expert. As I tell my students, you don't have to be good at anything to be an expert. You just have to be the only one doing it. And then you get invited all over the world because now you're the Great Salt Lake guru. So yeah, so I sort of stepped into Great Salt Lake sideways. I didn't grow up duck hunting on the lake like some people. I didn't grow up floating in the lake. I went there because I thought it was beautiful, because Terry Tempest Williams' words drew me there, and because I thought it might be a cool place to do biology.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that. Thanks for sharing that. What has it been like for you emotionally to watch this ecosystem you've studied for so long verge on collapse?
Yeah. Well, it was hard to get people's attention. And I think first off, it was like, well, let's work with teachers. Let's do some teacher workshops with Great Salt Lake Institute, because maybe, and some high school summer camps. Let's do that because maybe if we get the attention of young people, and they can see what's going on with the lake and get them excited about this cool system, maybe they can help educate their families. And So we worked with K through 12 in the summers sometimes quite a bit. And that led to, oh, maybe, there's no children's book on Great Salt Lake. Maybe we should write one. So we did. And we published a children's book and made sure teachers had that in their hands. And that's been really fun. Like, people are still buying that children's book, and you can get it at King's English if you're here in Salt Lake City, or mail order from them if you're outside of Salt Lake City, the King's English Bookshop. I'm giving them a plug. Anyway, I think it's that public education piece was always a part of what we wanted to do with Great Salt Lake Institute. And as the lake started really showing signs of not going back up, it started to carry more relevance, this work we were doing with the public. So not only am I doing research in class with students and teaching students, but now we're trying to outwardly work with the public. We're trying to be scientists that bridge that gap to communicate with the public directly. And so that outreach arm has always been a piece of something that, part of the reason that I started Great Salt Lake Institute was to have that interface with the public. And so as it got worse, we thought, well, maybe we should write something that could be more powerful. And we read Outside Magazine carried an obituary to the Great Barrier Reef, talking about as if the Great Barrier Reef was completely gone, and to call attention to its plight. And we thought, that's what we need. We need an obituary for Great Salt Lake. And like we do in obituaries, it would celebrate the life of this lake, and it would say all the things that we miss about it. And maybe that would wake people up. And so we wrote it in 2019. I think it was published in 2020. And literally nothing was happening at that time. Nothing was going on in the legislature. People really weren't paying attention. And then in 2022, we started hitting these historic lows. And I think that is the wake-up call. That's when Utah started getting all this international attention as that press release went out about the historic low. So that shook things up a bit. And I'm grateful that we set the stage for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What has the, I guess, feeling been like in the larger science community? You're in all these meetings, you're really active in the science community around Great Salt Lake. I'm curious if there's sort of a collective emotion or feeling as people are witnessing and studying this.
Yeah, I think that's definitely been true. I work a lot with state agencies. A lot of the people on these state agency groups are scientists. I work with academic scientists. I work with scientists all over the world who study other saline lakes. So I can tell you that the feeling of not being heard is something I hear a lot. And it reminds me a lot of something I didn't know I had anything in common with, which is sort of the plight of climate scientists. I think scientists in general, one of my criticisms of the scientific profession has been the lack of conversation with the public. I have a lot of public grants from the federal government. I feel like it's my duty to then tell the public who funds me what I'm seeing, and to make that in words that are understandable, that aren't just in the science jargon, but that we can communicate that story outward. So I try to use that skill. I try to be like Barbie and recognize that I have skills, and that's one of them. Is I can communicate scientists to people in words that don't get caught up in the jargon. So if we go look at what happened to climate scientists, I don't think there were a lot of them doing that very well. And I think that allowed them to be vilified and for the science to be politicized. And I think I've heard climate scientists say that is like a grieving moment, that they didn't understand. It's not what we're taught and to do in science. We're supposed to publish in journals and be peer reviewed by other scientists. We're not taught to speak out loud, to assisted living homes and go talk at the city park. That's not what we're trained to do. So I, I don't blame anyone for that, but I have heard people say that they think the movement at getting people to accept and understand climate change, that maybe that would have happened faster if there had been more trust and more communication with respect to scientists. So that being said, I think that we have all learned a lot from that conversation and from watching in the last couple of decades climate change be so politicized. Um, and, I always thought, well, once the insurance actuaries, because they use real data, once they start telling people that they can't insure their beach houses, these rich people are going to understand climate change impacts are real. And actually, sadly, that's what's happening after all these California forest fires and this stuff in Florida. And, insurance companies are actually going to drive this change. And so it's they can't use fake numbers, when they're computing what risk are. And we don't use fake numbers either. So we're looking at what we're seeing here. So I think I have a moral and ethical feeling about communicating what we're seeing at the lake. And that really wasn't what you asked. You wanted to know how that was impacting sort of scientists that work on the group as a whole. But I wanted to say that background piece because I think we all feel like our grieving should be more public, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but I think there are a lot of us that feel like we need to say it out loud. And that's why, we need to publicly talk about what's happening at the lake. I try to email people back when they email me. I try to call them back. Sometimes it gets overwhelming, but it's really, really important that we have these conversations and not just amongst scientists. And how is that extra burden of work impacting us? That's huge. That's huge.
Yeah, I think when we talked last, you said you get around 30 new contacts a week. Is that right?
Yep. I counted last summer. I was counting monthly into the fall, and the average was 30 new contacts a week, and that's a lot. Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, how do you manage all of that? You try and respond to all of them, but you don't have like an assistant to coordinate that for you, right?
I don't want to dump that on our staff because they have a lot going on too. So yeah, I mean, I basically tell people, I really appreciate hearing from them. I tell them my bandwidth if that's an issue, or I say, okay, I'll stop by and talk to your group if I can do that, So it just depends. Sometimes it's just a question. Sometimes the most beautiful comments are, people who have relationships with the lake and they want to tell me about them. And that's just so special, so I really appreciate those.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, what you were saying earlier about like climate scientists and communicating this grief and the work you've done with the obituary, it reminds me of something else we talked about a couple months ago, that you grew up in this very patriarchal science culture where emotions and feelings and personal motivations were not supposed to be part of your science. So I'm curious about some of the moments you've had throughout your career as a scientist that started challenging that notion for you.
Yeah, I mean, when my students interview for medical school, they're asked ethical questions sometimes, and when my students interview for graduate school, they're never asked about their whole person. They're only asked about what do you want to study and what have you done research on and how have you published it? It's only about the science, and it's not at all about other things. And so, yeah, even from your interviews forward, when you're training as a scientist, you don't really talk about any personal motivations. And I realized I was in class. I was in school with someone. I was in graduate school in a lab, and beneath me was another lab that was studying HIV. This was the early 90s, and so this was a virologist who had one of the only HIV containment labs in the country, and it was there were a couple grad students in his lab, and one of them became my friend, and he was gay, and he's like, well, I want to study HIV because this is killing gay men. And I think that's a really important place for me to work right now. And I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked that he would be seeking science that had a personal motivation, because I didn't understand that I could have my whole self in my science. Like that was not part of a discussion with anyone in my profession. And I think that kind of woke me up a little bit, because I was shocked and I had to ask myself, like, what was that? And then I met another scientist, and he's like, yeah, I'm studying breast cancer genes because my mom died young of breast cancer. And I was like, I can't imagine saying that. Like, I can't imagine saying I'm studying X because I personally have this motivation. Um, because I was nervous about putting my whole self, out there. So fast forward, I think that now that I taught a course at Westminster about science power structures, and I co-taught it with a philosophy professor. And so I made her read science and our students, and she made me and our students read philosophy. And it was super interesting, because I think one of the disconnects between scientists and the public is that we present ourselves as non-biased, and as, the work is over here and we are over there. If you read science papers, it is very common to see passive voice. For example, the test tubes were incubated at 37 degrees Celsius. Well, who incubated the test tubes? You didn't say, right? That's because the person doesn't exist in that sentence. So we even write as if the experiment just happened. And that keeps people out of it, right? That keeps people out of it. And when I try to insert myself more in my scientific writing, and I use pronouns or something in my work where I'm like, I incubated the test tubes, I will have an editor at journal like change that. So it's even hard to change the system. Anyway, I think I discovered by co-teaching with a philosopher a little more about why we do that in science, and it's both. It's BS that we are. I don't know if I could say bad words. It's BS that we are told that science is non-biased, because it's an endeavor of humans, and humans are innately biased. Science is innately patriarchal, and innately racist. If you don't believe me, look at the number of physics professors in the US. How many are women? It's something like 2 or 3%. Is it that women can't do math? Well, it turns out in Russia, the number is like 35% women. In Italy, it's also like 35% women. So is there something special about the brains of Italian women or Indian women that can do math and American women can't, right? So there are still problems that reflect bias in science, and they're very obvious and they're very measurable. And we need to, speak out about that. So it's okay to bring your personal motivations, and it's okay to talk about them. And it's also okay to talk about scientists as humans. We have these guardrails in place that allow the science that gets published to be scrutinized by multiple peers in the same field. They ask questions, they're skeptical. This is what we do in our publication scheme. So there's a way to work out around the bias and get data that is more trustworthy. and we have a system of publications on top of publications. Next year, I might publish something that disproves something I published this year, because science is a process. It's not just a product, a static list of facts. It's like this growing learning process, and it's kind of beautiful that way. So bring
Yeah.
yourself to your work.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I
Yeah.
could have a whole other conversation with you about that, because obviously that's something that journalists get confronted with too, right? Like we can't have our bias or personal motivations in our work too. So I think that's
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I also want to talk about some of the ways you've tried to open up these conversations with your students. I know we talk about in the Q&A story that was on High Country News about some of the climate grief talks you've taken your students to, and bringing a psychologist in to talk with your students. I'm hoping you can just share a bit more about that and what those experiences have been like, and what your students got out of that as well.
Yeah. In 2022, it was not uncommon for those of us who were working at the lake to just cry when we were out in the water and seeing the devastation before our eyes and not being able to stop it. It was really hard to be outside. And I had a student, we were maintaining a trail camera up near Spiral Jetty, where these tar seeps were. And one of our Great Salt Lake Institute students went up on the weekend without us one weekend to take the card out of the trail cam so we could see the images. And she confronted, there were like 22 juvenile pelicans who'd taken off from Gunnison Island, and they came down thinking it was water, and they landed in the tar seeps and got stuck. And she was there by herself, and she couldn't do anything to save these birds. They were covered in tar and they were still alive, and it was devastating. And so I think there are times when you're just there, present, doing work, and all of a sudden it's something emotionally impactful, and you should really feel that. And so that example with the pelicans was maybe the first time I started thinking about that, because really my training is in biochemistry and biophysics, right? So I'm supposed to be in the lab. So being outside is even different for my training. So being emotionally connected to something that's outside that I'm studying is also like distant from my training. So how do I help these young people who are growing up worried about the world, and then they see these devastating sights in front of them? And I think for students who are studying climate change, this is a huge area of study right now, is how do we help support climate grief? Well, I didn't even know it was a thing, right? So I started reading about it. And I read Britt Ray's book, and then I had the chance to talk to her when she came here. And I started passing this around to my students and took them to see her. And then I was like, I feel like we need to do group therapy or something. And I had this conversation with a new faculty member who is a psychologist who taught our group therapy class. And she's like, I'd be happy to do that, actually. I think that's really interesting. And so we got together a bunch of people who worked on the lake and included some of my students. And she sort of asked us, what are you feeling? And it was super interesting, because there were people from state agencies who are involved in monitoring the lake. There were lawyers who were studying water law. There were, there's a whole host of different people, writers. And it wasn't just my students and I, but it was broader than that. And everyone expressed how they hadn't been able to say out loud how they were feeling. And that right there tells you something's going on, right? Like we're feeling grief, but we don't even have a word for it because it's associated with our work. It's not like you lost a family member. It's like, this is your job. Like what? And so to be able to put words to that, to to know that climate grief exists and that people study it and people actually specialize their therapy in that. That was really new to me, and I was so happy to learn from the psychologists who helped and from all of these other folks who work on lake issues, and especially my students. It's really, really important to learn from them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Bonnie. I just have a couple more questions for you. So just if people do have questions for Bonnie, you can start putting them in the comments and we'll get to them in a few minutes. So now I want to turn to kind of a recent controversy that came up as a result of this story. What Bonnie said in the Q&A that was published a few weeks ago upset one of our lawmakers, Representative Casey Snyder, and he criticized the work you do at a forum on the Great Salt Lake last week. And this was a quote. He said, having an obituary about the Great Salt Lake or some sort of climate grieving therapy session that does nothing to save Great Salt Lake, nor does dancing as a bird. And for folks who don't know about the bird thing, there were a lot of activists throughout the recent legislative session who were up at the Capitol in bird costume and using art and theater as a form of activism. So Bonnie, I'm curious your response to that, how you felt hearing Representative Snyder say that, and yeah, anything you want to share in response to that.
Well, I first should say that I have told Representative Snyder several times I'm really appreciative of the work he's done for the lake and for water conservation. He grew up a duck hunter, and he has spent a lot of time on the lake, and I know he has respect for it. And so I always tell him that I appreciate that. I was rather shocked that he insulted me for writing the obituary and for talking openly about climate grief in your article. I don't know why he chose to insult me, but I think that's unprofessional for a representative. So I decided to be unprofessional too. Uh, he did this at a conference that we have every 2 years, a Great Salt Lake Issues Forum, where we pull together all the people who work on Great Salt Lake, including policymakers. And it's really a wonderful family that gets together every 2 years and talks about the lake. So he was invited as part of a panel, and he used that platform to insult me. So I had to facilitate a panel the next day. So I put his quote up on the slide and just put some contact information if anybody wanted to email him. Here's his email. Yeah, so I think it was really important to call that out. And the other thing that I think is insulting is when a man stands up and says, "Oh, the way you women are trying to change the system here, the way you're trying to work on Great Salt Lake, that's not the right way. We'll do, pat you on the head. We'll do it our way. You guys just go back to your business. We'll take care of it over here." I just know that's not going to work with me. Like, to say that the obituary had no impact, I think is actually ridiculous. That is measurable, and that was published well before the legislature did anything. And also to say that talking about climate grief or performance on the Capitol steps during the legislative session wasn't having any impact. I mean, show me the data. I think that's wrong, and I think it is also very sexist. He demeaned a lot of women who had been leading a lot of those efforts. So I had to call him out, and I hope folks will, if they hear this, will email Casey Snyder. It's csnyder@le.utah.gov. So if you don't agree, or if you do agree, you should send him an email and let him know how you feel.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a funny, dramatic story about how it all went down. But in all seriousness, it does make me just think about how we talk about or value diverse ways of engaging in this issue,
Mm,
right?
yeah,
And so here, yeah, if you just want to add anything on that of like, what is the value of having different approaches to this work? You know, I mean, I think I'm curious if Representative Snyder, for example, was also feeling the critique from activists that say they're not doing enough to get water to the lake, right? That their strategies aren't working. Like, I think
correct.
everybody is kind of getting that criticism right now that what they're
Yeah,
doing
that's a good
is
point.
working. So yeah, just what do you think about what is the value or importance of having different strategies and tactics in this movement?
I think we have to be working in all of these realms. And I have been saying, thanks, legislators. I really appreciate it. I give public talks. I list all the bills they've passed. I talk about the work they're doing and how I'm grateful, and how I'm grateful this isn't Texas, because you couldn't pass these kind of water conservation bills in Texas, right? So they've been working bipartisanly. A lot of these bills have been unanimous. And I think giving them gratitude for that work they've been doing is definitely in my wheelhouse. I do that. I reach out. And I also say when I'm disappointed about something. Like, if there's a comment that doesn't reflect truth, for example, then you should say that out loud. If there's an effort that um, could be really helpful for the lake and they refuse to take it up, you should say that out loud. That's okay. I think representatives need to hear that from the public. Um, but in terms of the different ways and the different things we are doing, it's so important. I learned a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, how important um, artists could be in climate change, and how visceral that they make us feel. So Bierstadt, for example, back in the day, tried to convince Congress that they need to fund westward expansion and other things, and did these incredible paintings. There's a bunch of them at Yellowstone that are a little overblown, but they make you feel Western landscape. And so that idea of using artwork to reach people for political purposes actually has a history. And I think when people write poetry, or they take amazing artistic photographs, or they paint, or they dance, um, the this kind of knowing is really, really important to convey, and it reaches people that maybe didn't read my last science paper. You know what I mean? Like, it's really important to reach people in their heart and their minds, and not just in the logical piece of themselves. Um, I think the other voice that really has been missing until recently are, that's indigenous voices. And that way of thinking and knowing and storytelling and oral histories, like, that communication with and about the lake is really, really relevant right now. And to dismiss all of that and say that passing legislation is the only way to do anything, and that these other means they do nothing, like that is so pompous.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks so much, Bonnie. I really appreciate that and this whole conversation. I think we're ready to open it up to questions if there are some. Yeah. So this first question, what is it like fighting for environmental issues in a red state?
I've been really surprised, again, how many pieces of legislation have passed in a bipartisan way. And I think that there are a lot of states where that's simply not true. It's not possible. And I think one of the reasons, like, if you were to compare us to Texas, for example, Texas is mostly privately owned land. And we have a lot of public spaces in Utah. We love our national parks here. We love to be outside. We understand water issues. And I just haven't seen it. It's not that there's no arguments about, and yes, we could do more, but I think we don't say enough how different we are in Utah to some of the other states that are definitely have an anti-environmentalist bent. I think Utah likes to ski and they want that water from the lake, right? There's lots of reasons to value Great Salt Lake, and the air quality issue is another huge one. It reaches everybody. So a lot of these efforts have actually been bipartisan, and I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Bonnie. I think that is the only question we have coming in from folks tuning in. So I'm gonna start wrapping this up. Just to conclude, want to say again that High Country News is a nonprofit reader-supported publication that has been covering the West for more than 50 years. We can't create stories like this great Q&A with Bonnie without supporters like you. So if you want to support our work, go to hcn.org to subscribe or donate. You can also find High Country News on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Threads, all the social media at High Country News. Bonnie, do you want to share any ways people can follow you or Great Salt Lake Institute?
Sure, just find us at GSL Institute and Great Salt Lake Institute at Westminster University.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bonnie. I really appreciate your time in this conversation. It's been super informative for me, and I appreciate everyone who tuned in as well.
Cool. Thank you so much, Brooke. I always love talking to you.
Yeah, you too, Bonnie. Thank you.
Cheers.